Hundreds of thousands of German soldiers lost their lives in the Soviet Union under Stalin's command at the end of the Second World War. The brutality of the conflict didn't stop on the battlefield. It carried on into prisoner of war camps. Over 2.8 million German soldiers were captured by the Soviet Union, facing a fate many describe as a slow and merciless execution. The winter of 1945 to 1946 marked the darkest period of this suffering, with thousands of prisoners enduring starvation, disease, and exploitation. Heartbreaking accounts describe 16-hour work shifts in the forests of Siberia or the mountains of the Urals, where hunger turned men into animals. To many Soviets, these soldiers symbolized the eternal enemy, bearing responsibility for the horrors of the Nazi occupation. Between 356,000 and more than 1 million Germans died in Soviet custody, victims of relentless vengeance. Stalingrad, where the Third Reich suffered its defeat at the hands of the Red Army on the 22nd of June 1941, the day the German invasion of the Soviet Union altered the course of history. Operation Barbarossa had begun. German troops advanced rapidly through Soviet territory. Amid the German invasion, their forces reached the city of Stalingrad, aiming to seize control of the city and secure a decisive victory for the German army. However, after months of intense fighting, Soviet forces managed to encircle the Germans in the city, cutting off their supply and communication lines. In November of 1942, the Soviets launched an offensive near Kalak, which left German soldiers unable to respond effectively. Their already fragile logistical situation deteriorated rapidly. The remaining defenders lost ground and suffered defeats in local skirmishes. Running out of food and supplies, their survival depended on what could be delivered by air. The extreme cold, snow, and diseases caused by poor sanitation, overcrowding, and malnutrition led to the collapse of the German Sixth Army. The situation for the wounded and sick became tragic as medical stations were insufficient to treat them all. Many died from infections and injuries that under normal circumstances would have been minor. On the 2nd of February 1943, Generals Konstantin Rosov and Nikolai Voronov reported that the German army had been defeated and that military operations in the Stalingrad region had ceased. On that day, 40,000 prisoners were added to the 50,000 captured during the preceding 2 days. Immediately after the surrender, German soldiers took anything they could find to keep warm. Soviet forces organized a prisoner camp in Beata, where the captives were gathered. The last Luftwaffe flight over Stalingrad took place on the 3rd of February, when a Handler He-11 circled over the city, searching for German soldiers who might have escaped the encirclement, aiming to deliver supplies. However, it found no survivors. After the surrender of the German Sixth Army, approximately 91,000 German soldiers were captured by the Red Army. Due to constant Soviet attacks and unfulfilled promises by Nazi authorities, the prisoners were captured in deplorable conditions. Many were already on the brink of death from starvation, extreme cold, and wounds. Long columns of prisoners were forced to march to nearby villages under the frigid February sun. Following the surrender, the soldiers were disarmed, stripped of their belongings, and made to endure long marches to remote, unknown villages. The prisoners were forced to march hundreds of kilometers under sub-zero temperatures, escorted by countless corpses toward labor camps in Siberia and other distant locations. These marches, carried out without adequate food, clothing, or medical care, resulted in the deaths of thousands of soldiers. Many succumbed to typhus, dysentery, scurvy, tuberculosis, edema, and malaria. Those unable to continue were simply executed in the darkness of the night. It is estimated that only 1/3 of the prisoners captured at Stalingrad survived the first weeks. Many perished on the march, while others died in the camps due to the inhumane conditions they endured. Ultimately, of the 91,000 prisoners, only around 5,000 survived. Frozen massacres, murders and torture in German prisoner camps in the Soviet Union exposed the harsh conditions in detention centers and forced labor camps. The gulags established by the NKVD in the 1930s continued to house the same prisoners who had been there before the outbreak of war. These included individuals accused of espionage, sabotage, aggravated theft, and especially political prisoners, condemned for spreading anti-Soviet propaganda or holding counter-revolutionary ideas. With the German invasion during the summer of 1941, the Soviet Ministry of the Interior established a new directorate responsible for managing labor camps for German prisoners of war and their allies. However, this directorate faced numerous logistical challenges due to a lack of manpower to build camps across Soviet territory. Additionally, the uncertainty of the battlefield made it difficult to determine suitable locations for these camps. During the first year of the invasion, the Red Army was only able to capture and detain a limited number of prisoners. The General Directorate for Prisoner of War and Inter-Affairs, created by the Ministry of the Interior, oversaw the creation and operation of these camps. However, resource shortages and ongoing battles hindered the effective establishment and management of the camps, limiting the number of prisoners that could be held during the first year of the invasion. The turning point came after the Battle of Stalingrad. After the battle, the situation changed dramatically. The capture of a large number of German prisoners allowed for the establishment of numerous labor camps, particularly in territory reclaimed by the Red Army during its counter-offensive in the Volga region around the Stalingrad area. Approximately 40 labor camps were constructed. These Soviet prisoner camps were characterized by food shortages, a lack of medical care, and extreme weather conditions. Thousands of prisoners housed in camps like Beoa and Cno Aris, which held the largest numbers of inmates, had to survive on meager rations consisting of black bread mixed with sawdust, potatoes, and occasionally beets or grains. Bekova, a former school damaged during the battle, lacked adequate facilities for the prisoners. Wood was used for makeshift shelters. From the doors and windows, firewood was taken, and prisoners slept in tight groups on the cold floor, trying to stay warm among the crowd of pale, frost-bitten bodies. In the early morning, winter temperatures often dropped below 30 degrees Celsius, which is below freezing. Most prisoners were suffering from serious illnesses, including diphtheria, muscle atrophy, respiratory diseases, and typhus. Corpses were not buried, and Soviet guards often took valuables from the dead before leaving their bodies to the freezing elements, which helped preserve them. There were reports of cannibalism, and theft was common. Guards sometimes enjoyed watching the dehumanization of the German army, the suffering, death, and brutality they endured. Prisoners were forced to work in mines, factories, and on construction projects for more than 12 hours a day, regardless of the harsh weather conditions. These tasks were done with old, simple tools, under the watchful eyes of guards who often used violence. Those who didn't meet work targets or showed any weakness were punished heavily. The combination of forced labor, lack of food, and disease led to very high death rates. Medical help in the camps was very limited, and injured or sick prisoners were often left to die without any treatment. Illnesses that could be treated under normal circumstances became death sentences. The lack of medical care and resources made the situation extremely dire for the prisoners. The camp regime was very strict, and even small mistakes led to harsh punishments. Prisoners faced beatings, solitary confinement, or even quick executions. Soviet guards had a deep hatred for the Germans, blaming them for the atrocities committed by the Nazis on Soviet soil. This hatred led to cruel treatment and a complete lack of compassion for the prisoners. By the summer of 1943, the Soviet Union began to receive aid packages from the United States, allowing for the distribution of basic food supplies to some prisoners. However, by that time, only a few thousand prisoners remained alive. The treatment of prisoners varied depending on their rank and influence within the Nazi hierarchy. Enlisted soldiers faced the worst conditions, while officers had some privileges. For example, in a former monastery in Yelabuga, east of Kazan, about 1,800 prisoners were held, and only one survived. In contrast, German generals were treated differently. They were interrogated but eventually released. However, they were used as propaganda tools by the Soviet regime, displayed as war trophies. This disparity showed the complex way prisoners of war were viewed in the Soviet Union. Friedrich Paulus, from German commander to Soviet prisoner, lived a life marked by captivity and suffering in the Soviet Union. His story, from his leadership in the Battle of Stalingrad to his imprisonment and later life, reflects the dramatic shift the Second World War brought to the Eastern Front. As commander of the German Sixth Army, Paulus played a key role in the battle. In November 1942, as German forces advanced toward the southern part of the city, Paulus found himself at the center of one of the most brutal confrontations of the war. The Soviet resistance, led by General Vasily Chuikov, was relentless, combined with harsh urban warfare tactics and severe weather conditions, causing the German forces to weaken. In January 1943, after weeks of intense fighting and a desperate struggle for survival in hostile conditions, Paulus was forced to surrender. Ironically, Paulus had considered Operation Barbarossa a mistake from the beginning, but felt compelled to follow Hitler's orders out of a sense of military duty. During the campaign, Paulus had advised cutting off the Soviet retreat to prevent their withdrawal into the interior, and had urged Hitler to provide winter clothing for the soldiers if the war dragged on. However, Hitler forbade any further mention of the subject, reflecting the tension and conflict between Paulus and the Nazi leadership. On the 30th of January 1943, Hitler promoted Paulus to field marshal, with the implication that he should take his own life rather than surrender. Paulus, however, disobeyed. In retaliation, the Gestapo arrested his sons, Ernst, Alexander and Friedrich, and sent them to a prison in the Alps, from which they were released in 1945. Meanwhile, Paulus's wife, Elena Rossetti, faced an uncertain future. Paulus was transported to a Soviet prisoner of war camp in the east. The journey into captivity was full of hardships. Paulus and his men suffered from extreme hunger, cold, and exhaustion. Once in the prison camps, they faced even more severe challenges. The Soviet camps for prisoners of war were overcrowded and lacked basic supplies. Food was scarce, the facilities were poor, and diseases spread rapidly. For Paulus, captivity was not only a personal ordeal, but also a political tool for the Soviet regime. The Soviets saw him as a valuable figure to further their propaganda efforts. As a high-ranking general, Paulus became a symbol of Soviet victory. His capture was used to showcase the superiority of the Red Army and to boost the morale of the Soviet population. In 1943, Paulus was paraded at public events and press conferences designed to humiliate him and project the image of a defeated leader who now denounced the Nazi regime. His appearances at these events were carefully orchestrated to promote Soviet ideology and highlight the enemy's weakness. After nearly a decade in captivity, Paulus was finally released in 1953. Tragically, his wife passed away just 4 years later. Paulus's release coincided with a period of improving relations between the Soviet Union and West Germany. However, his return to Germany was bittersweet. The nation he found was in ruins, struggling with a long and arduous process of reconstruction and redefinition. Returning to a divided Germany, Paulus faced a complicated and ambivalent legacy. His role in the Battle of Stalingrad and his decision to surrender had significant consequences. To surrender sparked intense debate and controversy, with some criticizing his actions while others viewed him as a pragmatic leader who valued the lives of his soldiers more than blind loyalty to Hitler. After his release, he served as the civilian head of the Institute for Military Historical Research until the end of his life. In his later years, he developed progressive bulbar paralysis, a serious and debilitating neurological condition that eventually led to his death in a clinic in Dresden on February 1, 1955. The partisan women who resisted Nazi terror after the Nazi invasion of the Soviet Union played a significant and vital role in the resistance. Many cities and towns united to fight against the invaders, and women were crucial to the Soviet partisan movement. For many, it was an opportunity to contribute to their country's defense, especially since recruitment offices of the Red Army often denied them the chance to join the regular army. Among the most remarkable partisans were young women who showed great courage and determination in their fight against the Nazis. One notable example is Zoya Kosmodemyanskaya, an 18-year-old high school student from Moscow who joined a partisan unit in October 1941. Alongside other partisans, she marched southwest towards Naro-Fominsk, crossing the front line into German-occupied territory. There, they carried out sabotage missions such as mining roads and cutting communication lines to weaken the enemy and support Soviet troops. On November 27, 1941, Kosmodemyanskaya received orders to set fire to the village of Petrovsk, where a German cavalry regiment was stationed. Together with her fellow partisans, Boris Kov and Vasil Kabov, she successfully burned 3 houses. However, while attempting to set fire to a 4th, she was captured by German forces. After her arrest, Kosmodemyanskaya was subjected to brutal treatment. She was stripped, beaten, tortured with 200 lashes, and parts of her body were burned. Yet she refused to give any information to her captors. The following day she was taken to the village center with a board around her neck that read, "Arsonist," and was publicly hanged. Her body was left on display for all to see. Despite the brutality of her death, Kosmodemyanskaya became a powerful symbol of resistance against the Nazi invasion. On February 16, 1942, she was posthumously awarded the title of Hero of the Soviet Union, becoming the first woman to receive this honor during the war. Zinovia Portnova, the youngest hero of the Soviet Union, was another young and courageous woman who joined the Belarusian resistance in 1942 at just 16 years old. Portnova became a member of a resistance group called the Young Avengers, distributing Soviet propaganda leaflets, collecting and hiding weapons for Soviet soldiers, and reporting on German troop movements. After learning to use weapons and explosives from older members of the group, Portnova participated in sabotage missions targeting a gas depot, a local power plant, and a brick factory. These actions are estimated to have killed over 100 German soldiers. In 1943, Portnova worked as a kitchen assistant in Obol, where she poisoned food intended for the Nazi garrison stationed there. When she fell under suspicion, she ate some of the food in front of the Nazis to prove it was not poisoned. Since the effects were not immediate, she was released. However, she later became violently ill but survived after drinking large amounts of whey. When she did not return to work, the Germans realized she was responsible and began searching for her. In January 1944, Portnova was captured after months of evading the Nazis. She was taken to a village called Gorani, where she was interrogated by a Gestapo officer. Believing her to be harmless, the officer let his guard down, allowing Portnova to seize his pistol and kill him. She also shot 2 German soldiers who entered the room and then attempted to flee into the forest. She was eventually caught near a riverbank. After her recapture, she endured intense torture before being taken to the forest and executed. She was not yet 18 years old at the time of her death. Despite her tragic end, Portnova was recognized for her bravery and sacrifice in 1958 and was posthumously awarded the title of Hero of the Soviet Union. A monument was erected in her honor in Minsk, and several youth pioneer detachments were named after her. Her legacy as one of the youngest and most courageous women of the Soviet resistance remains honored to this day. Walter von Zitz, the German general who betrayed the Third Reich, was born on August 22, 1888, in Potsdam, Germany, into a family with a long military tradition. In 1908, he joined the German army and served during the First World War, fighting on both fronts as a lieutenant in the Imperial German Army. After the war, he was promoted to captain and continued his military career during the Weimar Republic, gradually rising through the ranks. When the Second World War broke out, Zitz was assigned to command positions on the Eastern Front, participating in key campaigns, including the invasion of the Soviet Union in 1941. During the Battle of Stalingrad, he commanded the 51st Army Corps, which was part of the German Sixth Army under General Friedrich Paulus. His unit was involved in some of the fiercest fighting in Stalingrad, but like the rest of the Sixth Army, it became trapped when the Red Army encircled the city. As the situation for the German forces grew increasingly desperate, Zitz found himself at the center of one of the war's most critical battles. As conditions in Stalingrad worsened, Zitz grew increasingly opposed to Hitler's strategy of holding their position. At all costs, he promoted a strategic withdrawal to prevent the destruction of the Sixth Army, but his ideas were rejected by those in authority who followed Hitler's orders. This led to growing frustration among Seydt, who openly criticized Hitler's strategy on January 30, 1943, just before the Sixth Army's surrender. In recognition of his service, Hitler promoted Seydt to the rank of Field Marshal. This promotion came with an unspoken expectation that he would take his own life rather than be captured. However, Seydt defied this order and was instead captured by the Soviets, becoming one of the highest-ranking German officers to fall into enemy hands. After his capture, Seydt made the unusual decision to collaborate with the Soviets, following Stalin's orders. The Red Army's High Command tasked him with encouraging other German generals to conspire against Hitler. Generals such as Helmuth Schlumer, Moritz von Rey, and Alexander Edler von Dannels agreed to this collaboration. Seydt also took part in radio broadcasts from Moscow, sending anti-Nazi messages to German troops. This collaboration resulted in his citizenship being revoked, and a death sentence was issued against him by a Nazi military tribunal in absentia. His family also faced consequences, with several members being removed from official positions. In September 1943. In 1943, Seydt was appointed president of the League of German Officers, a group of captured officers in the Soviet Union committed to opposing Hitler. This group operated under the National Committee for a Free Germany, a Soviet-backed propaganda organization led by the communist writer Erich Vett. Seydt even proposed forming an armed force of prisoner soldiers to launch a communist guerrilla campaign in Germany. However, Stalin did not trust the idea of rearming German prisoners, and the plan was never carried out. Following the failed assassination attempt on Hitler in July 1944, Soviet intelligence concluded that Seydt's propaganda efforts had failed. Stalin ordered the dissolution of the League of German Officers, and Seydt, along with his collaborators, was re-imprisoned. He was tried and convicted of war crimes despite not being a communist. The Soviets tried to recruit him into their party, but he refused, stating his only goal had been to end the war and save Germany. In 1950, Seydt was sentenced to death, but the sentence was later commuted. After spending 14 years in captivity, he was released in 1956 and returned to West Germany. Upon his return, he sought to reclaim his properties, military rank and pension, succeeding only in overturning the convictions imposed on him by the Third Reich. Unlike many other generals, he did not publish memoirs and was largely shunned by his former comrades. He died in Bremen on April 28, 1976, after a life marked by controversy and rejection. In 1994, his descendants successfully petitioned Russian courts to annul the convictions imposed on him by the Soviet Union, granting a degree of posthumous Rehabilitation. During the collapse of the Third Reich, German women who were captured faced punishment and repatriation. At the outbreak of war in 1939, approximately 140,000 women were associated with the German armed forces. Of these, 50,000 worked in administrative roles, while 99,000 served as auxiliaries. As the war progressed, the number of women involved in the military increased significantly, reaching 300,000 by 1944. Under military law, their roles gradually expanded, placing them not only within Germany but also in occupied territories such as the General Government, Belarus, the Baltic states, occupied France, Yugoslavia, and Greece. Among these women, approximately 8,000 worked in communications, while 12,500 were attached to the army in the field. Additionally, nearly 130,000 women served in the LVFA, primarily in administrative and auxiliary roles, although more were assigned to operate anti-aircraft batteries. Initially, it was rare to find German women on the front lines, let alone captured as prisoners. However, as the regime's situation worsened, women were armed for self-defense in the final days of the war. Hitler reversed his earlier stance on the militarization of women, authorizing the creation of an armed women's battalion to boost male morale. A significant number of women from the German Red Cross also worked alongside the armed forces and were theoretically protected under the Geneva Convention. German policy generally sought to avoid the capture of women serving in the armed forces, and local commanders were held personally responsible for their safety in cases of immediate danger. On September 30, 1944, orders were issued to evacuate all women under the age of 21 from occupied territories. This policy conflicted with the growing need for their skills and the heavier workloads required to free more men for frontline duties. Women captured by the Allies at the end of the war were treated similarly to their male counterparts. Over 100 women were detained at barracks in northern Pilsen, where they formed a choir known as the Pilsen Sparrows and sang for their captors. Initially under American control, Pilsen was later handed over to the Soviets, creating urgency to address the issue of female prisoners. Most were released, but after evaluations, a communications assistant was detained upon identification as an SS member. Fear of returning home and post-war repatriation led many women to be unwilling to return to their homes in the Soviet occupation zone, fearing what might happen upon their return. There are no clear records of when these women were eventually released and repatriated, though it is assumed that all had left the camps by the end of 1948. In Soviet prisoner of war internment camps, it was common for women to have their heads shaved, and some were imprisoned. Approximately 200 women were martyred in the final days of the war, likely tortured to death to extract confessions. After the war, many people who had been involved in German war crimes faced significant challenges and revenge as the Soviet Union worked to hold them accountable. The brutal experiences of the Holocaust, especially in places like Leningrad, led to deep hatred towards Germans among Soviet citizens, which sometimes resulted in violent acts of revenge. Soviet authorities often turned a blind eye as former Nazis were attacked, stoned or beaten to death by enraged Russian citizens. The Babi Yar massacre, one of the most tragic episodes of World War II, took place in September 1941, when German forces, with the help of Ukrainian police and nationalist groups, carried out one of the worst atrocities of the war. The massacre happened near the Babi Yar ravine on the outskirts of Kiev, where over 33,000 Jews were murdered in just 2 days. The SS used the destruction of the German headquarters in central Kiev as a pretext to begin systematically exterminating the Jewish population, forcing them to dig their own graves before being executed. Before the executions, the SS also evacuated a nearby psychiatric hospital and murdered all its patients. Babi Yar became a common burial ground for both victims and perpetrators as the war progressed. the massacres did not end with the Jewish victims. By late 1941, relations between the Nazis and certain Ukrainian nationalist groups deteriorated, leading to the execution of 600 of their former allies in the same ravine. Babi Yar thus became a site for mass executions, where thousands of Jews, Roma, Soviet prisoners of war, and civilians opposing the Nazi regime were killed. Beyond the massacres, the Nazis enforced a regime of forced labor, enslaving millions of Ukrainians, including prisoners of war. Reprisals against Ukrainian resistance and sabotage were equally brutal, with hundreds of villages and towns destroyed in retaliation. As Soviet forces neared Kiev in the summer of 1943, the Nazis launched an operation to conceal evidence of their crimes. Surviving prisoners were forced to exhume the bodies from the mass graves and burn them, after which the Nazis executed the prisoners involved in the cover-up. The exact death toll remains uncertain, but estimates suggest that between 100,000 and 200,000 people were murdered at Babi Yar. Paul Blobel, the SS officer responsible for these atrocities, was sentenced to death during the Nuremberg trials and executed in 1951. Another officer, Otto Rasch, was also charged but died in prison in 1948. Following the liberation of Ukraine, Soviet authorities held trials to prosecute local collaborators and Nazi officials responsible for war crimes. Defendants faced charges similar to those at Nuremberg, including the execution of civilians, forced labor, and other atrocities. One of the most notable trials took place at the Kiev State Theatre, where Ukrainian prosecutors presented evidence from survivor testimonies, intelligence reports, and physical evidence from massacres and forced labor camps. 15 Nazis were ultimately convicted for their roles in the Babi Yar massacres of September 29th and 30th, 1941. 12 of them were sentenced to death and publicly executed in Kiev's Central Square on January 29th, 1946. These executions were filmed and preserved as archival material, later used in a 2022 Ukrainian documentary by filmmaker Sergei Loznitsa titled Justice. Despite these trials, many of the direct perpetrators, both German and Ukrainian, who participated in the Babi Yar massacres were never brought to justice. This lack of accountability highlights the enduring challenges of addressing the full scope of the atrocities committed during the Nazi occupation of Ukraine. Following the war, Stalin's plans for revenge against Germans were extensive. The destruction caused by the Nazis in the Soviet Union was so severe that reconstruction was expected to take decades. Stalin repeatedly declared that prisoners from all enemy states, regardless of nationality, could expect prolonged periods of forced labor. This plan was publicly announced in Moscow over the previous 2 years. At the Tehran conference in late 1943, Stalin spoke of needing 4 million forced laborers for many years as part of war reparations. By the summer of 1944, this demand had increased to 5 million workers over a 10-year period, which he reiterated in subsequent meetings with the Allied powers. On December 16, 1944, a general order was issued stating that all German men aged 17 to 45 and all women aged 18 to 30 in liberated southeastern Europe who were capable of working were to be transported to the Soviet Union within 2 months. Approximately 110,000 individuals had already been identified and transported, with another 100,000 joining them from occupied Germany in the early months of 1945. The forced relocation and exploitation of German prisoners of war held by the Soviets were also transported to the Soviet Union, with about 100,000 deemed exempt due to various reasons. Age, illness, or youth played a significant role in determining the fate of the remaining prisoners. These individuals were mainly confined to approximately 60 camps located in Poland and eastern Germany before being transferred to the Soviet Union. The process of relocation was completed by the end of October 1945. In addition, some prisoners were sent to particular locations in other territories controlled by the Soviets, which were rich in important natural resources. One such place was Yakimov in Czechoslovakia, where prisoners were put to work extracting uranium for Stalin's nuclear program. Initially, Stalin claimed that prisoners would be held as long as necessary for the reconstruction of the country, which he estimated would take 15 years. However, most Axis prisoners were eventually released by the Soviet Union between May 1945 and the end of 1949. This period of detention was still longer than the periods of detention experienced by most Allied powers. The majority of those who were released were elderly, sick, or otherwise unable to contribute to the workforce. On June 6, 1945, it was decreed that future releases or repatriations required approval from the Politburo based on a specific set of criteria. By this time, the Soviet secret police had compiled a list of approximately 225,000 German and Austrian soldiers who were in camps or hospitals and were considered unfit for work. However, this list excluded officers who were to remain in captivity. In August of that year, a total of 78,500 Germans were identified for release due to their inability to work. The fate of the remaining prisoners was a matter of great concern for Soviet authorities. They were keen to release those who were deemed economically unproductive, but wanted to prevent the release of individuals suspected of harboring anti-Soviet sentiments. Such individuals were held under various pretexts to maximize the labor potential of the prisoners. Sergei Krov, head of the Ministry of Internal Affairs, suggested sending home 150,000 men who were unfit for work and increasing the rations of the remaining prisoners by 10% in an effort to boost productivity. German accounts of captivity in the Soviet Union reflect the widespread culture of hunger that pervaded the 2,500 camps. This scarcity mirrored the plight of nearby civilian populations, as the country's productive capacity had been devastated during the war. These accounts describe rampant theft, hoarding of food, and adherence to food taboos, even in the face of starvation. They also recount theft and trade of food within the camps and the slow, listless movements of prisoners in their daily activities. Desperation was evident in the lengths some prisoners went to in order to be declared unfit for work and sent home. Self-mutilation became a grim reality once it was understood that the unfit were being repatriated. Reports surfaced of men amputating their fingers or deliberately injuring their eyes to induce blindness. Others resorted to subtler methods, such as consuming large quantities of salt to cause edema. Some succeeded in being repatriated as a result, but others lost their lives in the process. The painful end of the war and the high price of Soviet revenge after the Battle of Stalingrad saw tens of thousands of German soldiers captured and subjected to inhumane conditions in Soviet labor camps. These soldiers faced extreme cold, severe hunger, and the constant threat of violence or execution by their captors. The logistics of the death marches were designed to break the prisoner's will, with brutal conditions, lack of supplies, and physical exhaustion, resulting in high mortality rates. Many lives were lost before even reaching their uncertain destinations. Those who survived the marches faced equally harsh conditions in Soviet labor camps, marked by chronic malnutrition, endemic diseases, and grueling physical labor. The ordeal of German officers, such as Walter von Seydlitz and Karl Strecker, exemplifies the hardships faced by German officers in captivity. Seydlitz distinguished himself through his resilience during the Battle of Stalingrad and his subsequent capture, while Strecker endured the same extreme conditions as other prisoners in the labor camps. The KEE trial, often called the Nuremberg of Kiev, was a significant effort by the Soviet Union to deliver justice to the victims of Nazi crimes. This process included high-ranking officers responsible for atrocities such as the Babi Yar massacre. The trial aimed not only to punish the guilty, but also to serve as a propaganda tool, reinforcing the Soviet narrative of resistance and justice. The repatriation of German prisoners of war to their homeland after years of captivity marked a bittersweet conclusion. They returned to a Germany devastated by war, deeply transformed and struggling with displacement, poverty and reconstruction. These returning soldiers faced physical and psychological scars and the difficult task of reintegrating into a society vastly different from the one they had left. For many, the return represented a moment of reconciliation with their past and with the emerging new order in Europe. The turning point of Stalingrad, considered the bloodiest battle in history, was a turning point in World War II. The defeat of the German armies signaled the beginning of its decline on the Eastern Front. The Wehrmacht suffered significant losses in both manpower and equipment. The lack of resources and the violence of the war caused a humanitarian crisis in Germany, displacing thousands of people who struggled to access food, water, or shelter. The defeat at Stalingrad severely weakened German logistics and marked the limits of their eastward advance. The surrender of Field Marshal Friedrich Paulus, the first in German military history, plunged Hitler into a deep depression. The losses at Stalingrad, both human and material, hastened the collapse of the Third Reich, which culminated in the fall of Berlin in 1945. This event serves as a somber reminder of the brutality and extreme suffering that characterized World War II. It also stands as a testament to the importance of remembering and learning from history to avoid repeating the mistakes of the past.